So video games and Hollywood are kind of melding into being the future, I guess, now. And it really is a degeneration of the arts. I really do think that that's true. And there's actual conspiracy evidence to suggest that. The Frankfurt School so-called philosophers spoke about the advantages of degrading the arts in the West, and that they could do this through various means. And what this would do would have a tremendous social engineering impact. And so we've all probably been made aware of, I don't know, maybe the audience doesn't know, but there have been even mainstream reports, I think in the Telegraph or the Independent, that have talked about, the CIA's role in engineering modern art and sort of degrading it and turning it into something that's toxic and social engineering. And so it's not really about what we might think of the arts being about, reflecting beauty, the aspirations of man, higher ideals, or these kinds of things. Now it's kind of really, for the most part, co-opted by globalist interests, the superstate, et cetera, et cetera. So this is why you have so many things in the music industry or the arts in general or Hollywood or film really just becoming an indoctrination process. And the only way that a person, generally speaking, gets ahead in a lot of those fields, is if they go along, if they play along with the agenda. And I do think there's a across the field covert agenda that you can actually demonstrate. And this is kind of what I go into in my book in some respects is, the background players, the Hollywood Illuminati, we might say, who have taken over the film industry. And interestingly now, it seems like China is apparently buying off a lot of the big studios. And we know that this is going to be used for geopolitical and social engineering purposes. So anyway, that's a long story. But in terms of your question about my interest in film, when I guess I grew up in the 80s like everybody else who probably reads my site, it's a lot of 80s stuff there. But, I was entranced with Indiana Jones and E.T. and Spielberg movies and Star Wars and all the typical stuff that a kid from the 80s likes. And so, I don't know, I found the medium itself very fascinating, very mysterious, because you're combining so many different arts. You've got sound, you've got sight, you've got playing with time through editing and so forth. So I always wanted to make movies, always wanted to be involved in that kind of a process, but things didn't work out that way for me. So I ended up studying philosophy, and then as you get older, you start to realize that you can kind of do a philosophy of anything. And this is the great thing about the discipline of philosophy, is that there's anything that's out there in the world you could do a philosophy of taking a shit if you wanted to. I mean, there's literally a philosophy of anything. You could do a philosophy of humor, a philosophy of the arts, philosophy of whatever. And so that kind of allowed me, through studying that in undergrad and grad school, to look back at film in my 20s. And I thought, well, actually, I should start a blog and just talk about all these different aspects of what I'm interested in relationship to film and to movies. So that's what Jay's analysis is, and then what the book is.
Well, certainly you could do a philosophy of taking a shit on the screen, which is what a few directors seem to have done over the years.
That would be modern art, exactly.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into the whole, I think everybody accepts that in movies we get fed messages, propaganda at different levels. It all sounds a bit conspiratorial, but as we work through this, we'll put some flesh on those bones. One of the earliest film memories I have, probably because it scared the shit out of me, which is kind of comical to think back on now, was watching the original movie of The Blob.
Yeah. It scared me as a kid, yeah.
Yeah, I remember Mum used to not let me watch films late at night, and I was round at a friend's house, and they had a different set of rules. So I watched The Blob, and I had nightmares about it that night, and I remember clearly waking up just in a terrible state, and her saying, "I told you not to watch those films,"
Mm-hmm.
But that's probably my earliest one. But for me, in the era I lived in, or grew up in rather, I was a child in the 70s, and for me, even looking back now, I didn't realize it at the time, of course, but I think it's very much a golden age of cinema in many ways. Depends on your perspective. There was a lot of junk in the way that there is in any decade, but things like The French Connection, The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, Dirty Harry, Shaft, these are films that just live on. I never tire of them, And also, when you look at those films, you look at the heroes. Okay, Clint Eastwood's a pretty good-looking guy, but look at the heroes in The French Connection or in The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3. These are not leading men as you would think of Hollywood now. They've all got to be chiseled and pretty boys with symmetrical faces and a full head of hair. So that's something that's definitely changed, and I suppose it reflects, if you think about those movies that were set in New York, that was a pretty dark decade in many ways in America. So those are the films for me that just, when I put them on, remind me of not so much childhood. I wouldn't have been allowed to watch films like that as a kid, but certainly being a teenager, those films were constantly rerun on TV. They don't seem to be anymore, actually.
Yeah, that is really weird. I have noticed a lot of those similar patterns where you'll see kind of things kind of thrown down the memory hole. And again, this is I think probably done intentionally in terms of the arts. Now, part of it is just the fact that, like you said, the younger generation doesn't even know about these things or has no interest in them. I remember when I was doing my research assistant work as an undergrad, this was about 3 or 4 years ago. I was working with a bunch of 18, 19, 20-year-olds at the library at the university, and I'm not joking. Many of them had no idea what The Godfather was. They didn't know who the Beatles were. They'd never heard of Led Zeppelin. They'd never heard these things. I couldn't believe it that, people, even 18, 19, 20 years old, had never heard of these things. So part of it is, as you said, that sort of ignorance of just being enmeshed in very weird things like anime and whatever else. Tumblr, anime, trying to become a social justice warrior, and video games, I guess, is what you're into if you're 18. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the decades, that is very interesting. There are different flavors and feels and senses from different decades. I think that there were a lot of bright spots in the 70s, like you said. A lot of the dystopian science fiction in the 70s was really cool, and I include a couple of those in my book, like Zardoz and Logan's Run. But then when you get to the 80s, you've kind of got the big blockbusters that really take Hollywood it was kind of a boom period, I think, in the 80s. And then I think things sort of started tanking once the internet came along. And so they switched over to Netflix, and and I think even the Russian, one of the Russian ministers talked about the fact that Netflix is actually a global social engineering program. And I think he's correct about that, because the advent of the internet, of course, it makes everything global. So you're not bound by the satellite and cable networks anymore. It can be something transmitted everywhere. And so the so-called Western values, can now be beamed into Serbia and into Turkey and, anywhere that the establishment wants to beam it. And so I think that's the danger in that regard. But yeah, I talk about a lot of this kind of stuff in the book as well. I talk about just the overall control of the arts. And I noticed that there were some books that touched on this, a couple academic books I'm thinking of, that would discuss the CIA's connections to Hollywood and how they might influence this or that film. And then there's other books that would talk about it from an academic perspective, like Operation Hollywood, where the Pentagon would pay to have certain messages in films. And a lot of the 80s films would be military recruitment films and so forth and so on. But I thought that after you read those, you get the impression that it's very limited in its scope. But I started realizing, well, actually, a lot of these actors, especially the big A-listers and people like this, they actually oftentimes do work for intelligence agencies in some capacity. And this even comes out in mainstream news. And so the more that you dig on these topics, you start to discover that there's a lot closer intimacy than most people think. And so that's a big part of what I write about in the book. And like you said, you could call it conspiratorial, but if the facts lead you there, then it doesn't matter what term you want to use, conspiratorial or not. That's just the fact of the matter.
Yeah, you can almost not use the word conspiracy these days, even though if you look it up in the dictionary, it's very straightforward. And, there's conspiracies everywhere, but of course, conspiracy theory, well, we all know the story behind that particular piece of propaganda. Two things that sprung to mind out of what you just said. One is like, wow, haven't heard of Led Zeppelin, but then I was like, well, I think about it, Greg, actually, yeah, that is believable. I mean, I was having a conversation the other day with a girl, and she's like mid-20s, and I was trying to think of something that was like another song, and I was saying, oh yeah, that, you know what that sounds like to me? I said, it sounds like Vienna by Ultravox. And she just looked at me. And I went, you know, the one with the girl running down the stairs, you know, it's a very classic video. She's like, what? I went, Ultravox. And she's like, no. To me, then I had to think, well, of course, man, just because that seems obvious to you. You know, it's not like everyone in the world bought that record, and you don't hear the record on the radio anymore. So your point about things being memory hold, even if it's not deliberate, it's just amazing how quickly stuff can go away if it's not put right in front of people. And it's all very well to say that everything's on the internet, but that's in itself is part of the problem, because, you know, it's almost like everything's there, so you can find nothing on one level. So
no, this is a great point of the never-ending infinite data stream, and how it sort of relativizes and negates truth and information, actually, because there's an infinity of information, and I think it sort of destabilizes, and it makes you lose your ground. You become dizzied by the infinite series of facts. I think that the Facebook scrolling feed was done on purpose to be that way. And it's sort of I call it a kind of a techno-nihilism. And because what it does is that it makes everything equalized. It's a great equalizer, the internet I'm speaking of. And then it turns, I mean, there's a lot of good. I'm not saying it's all bad, but I'm just saying that this is one of the downsides, is that it kind of, because it equalizes everything, it therefore degrades everything. So you can have, you know, you're scrolling through Facebook and you're seeing, on the one hand, some great piece of art that's right next to an ad for Viagra. You know what I mean? It's like, it's like everything is equalized and has no meaning. There's no, higher qualities given to some things over other things. Anyway, so it may in the long run have that negative effect, but I don't want to be totally pessimistic. I mean, there's a lot of great things about the internet too, but yeah, I think that the arts are suffering tremendously and have for a long time, because of just the scale of the social engineering and the naivety, and I guess the unwillingness on the part of people who go into the arts. Of course, you know, they tend to be very right-brained. They're not very interested in doing analytical, you know, research on who's funding their where they're getting their grants from or whatever. But, you know, what you come to discover is that much more of this stuff is controlled than you think. I mean, I always say that when I was writing the book, if I had been talking to myself 10 years earlier, you know, and I was already interested in conspiracy topics and so forth, but if I knew all the stuff that I knew when I was 35 and talking to myself when I was 25, I would think I was insane, because it just sounds crazy. You're telling me that it's that controlled, and it actually is, unfortunately. So that's the scary part.
The last film I remember going to see at the cinema, that I came out of just thinking, oh yeah, wow, and I want to see it again immediately, was Cold in July. I don't know if you saw that, but the thing with that is it was set in the 80s. It had an 80s soundtrack. You know what I mean? And it was kind of like, they didn't need to do that for the story. I mean, it had no hinging whatsoever on the plot, but they just did it, and it was kind of, I just thought it was interesting, because if you'd seen that same story made in the 80s, it would have looked and sounded like it did. You know, the guy, one of the main protagonists is a guy, and he's got a mullet and a mustache. There's still guys in the States that look like that, but you know, that was like that was contemporary. You know, Don Johnson's in it, for God's sake.
I can go down the road and see those dudes.
Yeah, I'm sure you can.
I could go like a couple doors over, and we could get them on the call right now if we want. The mullet dude. But
yeah, let's not do that.
I was gonna say.
Yeah,
no, I'm joking.
The only good thing about mullet is it doesn't really work on radio. You know, like for all I know, you've had a mullet recently cut. I just don't know. I can't tell. So,
if I had a mullet, it actually would come through on audio. It's
okay,
just that it would be that intense, but.
It would be that awesome, would it? Yeah. Oh, you're talking about mullets now makes me want to watch a Chuck Norris film. It really does. Yeah.
So Walker, Texas Ranger.
Well, just as long as he's got a mullet in it, I don't mind. knocking out the bad guys with a mullet whip. You know, you move your head really sharply to one side.
Just turn your head real quick.
Yeah, and your mullet keeps going. This is not why we're here. Have you ever done an analysis of The Deer Hunter? Suddenly I was thinking about that because that's 70s and that's one of my favourite movies, and I had an argument with someone not that long ago and they just said it was pure bullshit propaganda, you know, pro-war, pro-American, anti-Asian.
I've seen it twice, and I've contemplated an analysis more than once, but I haven't gotten around to doing it just because I haven't fully made up my mind on the film yet. So, but I definitely plan to. I have like a giant stack of to get tos, and I get emails and messages and so forth like every day. People are like, "Why haven't you done this? Why haven't you done this?" And you know, it's just I don't know. It's just a matter. Sometimes it's weird too, like it has to be the right time, and the analysis just kind of clicks. And a lot of times I've noticed that the timing was good because if I'd written on a certain film before I actually did, there would have been a lot of things I didn't know that explain aspects. You know, there's something very mysterious about how, you know, knowledge works and synchronicity and all this kind of stuff that I think is all true because, I don't know, so things just kind of coalesce. Like, for example, I did my Twin Peaks analysis, I think, a year and a half, 2 years ago, and I had a whole pretty vast theory about what all was going on. And that has become one of the more popular analyses now, and it did make it into the book. And then subsequently, I didn't even know this, by the way, until a couple of weeks ago, but Mark Frost, the co-creator with David Lynch, wrote a book about Twin Peaks, and it's kind of a fictional expansion of the history and background of Twin Peaks, and it confirms everything that I wrote. So that was a good thumbs up for me. Like, it was a confirmation that I had the details right on solving that.
Well, I find it, we talked about propaganda here and you've mentioned the CIA. We'll get into some of that, but this is not to say that, you know, no matter what's going on with a film or what the intention or lack of intention behind it was, not to say that you can't enjoy it for what it is.
Sure.
I find it's just, but if you're armed with a bit of foreknowledge, it doesn't necessarily spoil your enjoyment of a film, you know, just because you can read different layers and levels in it. If you see what I mean, I think actually it can help sometimes. I mean, certainly some of the films that you've talked about, I remember watching. I mean, I'd known about Kubrick, for example, and his reputation for inserting all sorts of meaning and messages into his movies, and I actually saw Eyes Wide Shut for the first time in a hotel in Iceland, of all places, and it was just it's just all I could find on the TV that was in English. So I just lay in bed and watched it, and I could tell straight away, look, this thing is full of all sorts. God knows, you know, how many levels are in this thing. But I could just, I was able to forget about that and just enjoy the story, you know. So we're not trying to destroy people's, illusions here. You know, you can keep your illusion if you want, but I think it adds something. It's the same with music. You know, I've done music criticism for a long time, and, because you can understand how, well, rock and pop, how that works, what it does on, you know, physically, emotionally, psychologically. That doesn't destroy it. It just makes it more interesting, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, this is not to say that everything is, again, not everything is a Pentagon run or whatever. I think that the tendency, if you look at what's documented, is they're mainly concerned with what most people are going to see. So a propaganda heavy film is going to be something that is going to be a blockbuster that's going to have, you know, hundreds of millions of people possibly watching it. You know, like the Bond films, that those are so widely known and recognized for so many decades, the second most popular and successful franchise in film history after Harry Potter. You know, they're going to be interested in what kinds of messages are in that film. You know, more independent films, or like you said, these dystopian type films from the 70s, like Logan's Run or Omega Man or something like that. You're going to find pretty good messages, I would say, in those kinds of films. Something like David Lynch's Twin Peaks, you know, I don't really think that there's a lot of propaganda in that. There's actually quite a bit of revelation in that. And but so yeah, it's not an all or nothing thing. It's not one thing. You know, it's just like life in general. There's a lot of different factors, a lot of different layers, a lot of complexities, and different players and different motivations and interests involved. But you know, when we're looking at these, say, big-scale J.J. Abrams type productions or something like that, we actually have documented evidence that he worked with the CIA in the creation of Alias. There's a whole PhD thesis that was written on that by Tricia Jenkins that was turned into the book CIA in Hollywood. So I rely on her book in a couple chapters and cite her several times. So, that's an example of something that there we can document and say that this was an actual case where, J.J. Abrams was working directly with Central Intelligence, and it was absolutely involved in propaganda. And part of what Alias was to try to recruit people for the military and or intelligence work. So, this is how this all works. I remember in the 80s, my dad joined the Navy because he watched Top Gun, in part. Now, my dad's heterosexual, so it wasn't because of the weird sort of homoerotic stuff that's in Top Gun. But if you go back to the 80s, the Reagan had allocated, if I recall, quite a bit of money to Hollywood for these kinds of movies. And so there was all these movies back then, like Iron Eagle and Little Nikita and what else, Top Gun, Navy SEALs. These are all just sort of loosely recruitment films. And it even gets a little more ridiculous with goofy ones like Space Camp, which is basically just a 2-hour hour and a half advertisement for NASA and going to space camp. You think about Mac and Me. Mac and Me is like a ripoff of E.T., and it's a, hour and a half advertisement for McDonald's. So in other words, you start to see these patterns that on the one hand, it's not just propaganda and social engineering. It was also large-scale advertising. Movies become big 2-hour advertisements.
Yeah, of course. I mean, not even product placement. That's a cliched thing from the past now.
Right, but beyond that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read Starship Troopers, but certainly the movie they made, I remember people saying, it was just, the book was just propaganda, pro-military, but the movie certainly tipped over into comedy and farce. The idea that, you might sign up after watching Starship Troopers. And I find a lot of more modern films, contemporary ones that you and I might look at and go, yeah, this is very clear propaganda. It's just so over the top that I'm like, who's actually buying this? Of course you find out millions of people are, but I just find I don't know if it's desperation or what it is, but they just lapsed into the point of just being absolutely ridiculous.
If I recall, I read somewhere that at West Point or upper level military, like if you're getting your PhD or something in military studies, that they read Heinlein extensively. Mm-hmm. And that sounds plausible to me, given the fact that a lot of what's in Heinlein is kind of this, it's actually transhumanist kind of propaganda. I think he was in Crowley type circles. I don't know if he was actually a Crowleyan, but he was definitely in those kinds of circles. And Heinlein's Moon is a Harsh Mistress. You have like the prediction of the AI software that kind of comes alive and leads this libertarian revolution or something like this. So you could actually see why that would be advantageous for something like West Point or Army War College or something like that, because the whole Atlanticist Anglo-American establishment philosophy is, on its face at least, this idea of so-called libertarianism, right? The long march of liberty against all of the empires and the tyrants and all this nonsense, which I think is just propaganda. But it is interesting that I think Paul Verhoeven is who did Starship Troopers. He turned it into a satire. So the movie's actually kind of funny when you watch it from the satire perspective. Starship Troopers, I'm speaking of here. But yeah, all of that kind of stuff. I wish I had gotten to some of that stuff, because it is really interesting, especially if you look at Asimov and how he predicted Google as well. So you have a lot of these like 40s and 50s era sci-fi guys predicting things that we see today. The internet, Neuromancer with William Gibson. You've got like The Matrix and this kind of stuff. So yeah, definitely. I think if there's a sequel to Esoteric Hollywood, we'll probably go down that route.
Yeah, I remember reading Fountains of Paradise by Arthur C. Clarke many years ago. Now, at that state, well, not when he wrote it. When I read it, the internet existed as a military infrastructure, but I hadn't, and even at that point, we had computers at school that were networked. But it hadn't really occurred to me that this could become a global thing. And I remember reading his description of this screen that the guy had in his room that brought selected news, what he all the subjects he was interested in were all filtered and packaged for him. And he was able to talk to other people around the world on his screen and stuff. And I remember thinking, wow, that would be so cool, wouldn't it? But I just couldn't see how it would be possible. And then, probably only 10 years later, when I first got on the internet, not my own computer, but was in 1993 at university, and the first thing I thought wasn't like, oh, cool, you know. It was like, well, I went in, and whatever search engine there would have been at the time, God knows, I must look up and see what search engines there were in 1993, but typed in...
Netscape Navigator.
Okay, well, I think I typed in science fiction, because that's something I was really interested in, and the results came back. I remember thinking, oh my God, look at all this material. This could be such a colossal waste of time. That was my first thought about the internet.
Interesting. You want to know what the first thing it was around that time, maybe 1995, the first thing that I searched for on Netscape Navigator.
What was that?
KLF.
Oh, wow. That was the, no, I suppose that would have been several years after the White Album was out. Was it called? No, it wasn't called that. What was it called? Was it Chill Out or? I'm trying to
well, the White Album was, I think, 91, and that's the one that had the big radio hits. But Chill Out, I think, was 87 or 88 was Chill Out.
Oh, okay.
But that was actually some pretty weird avant-garde sort of predictive stuff, too, because if you read, is it Bill Drummond? I forget whose book. One of the two KLF guys wrote.
It's probably Bill Drummond. He's the guy that burnt the money, isn't it?
Yeah, he wrote a book about how you sample and loop and create a number one hit single, and it's as a joke, right? But now that is kind of like the entire music industry is that. So I see it as kind of prophetic in a way, because, you know, they're these sort of performance artist / chaos magic anarcho type guys, and they're talking about all this stuff from decades ago, and they're implementing the Robert Anton Wilson, you know, Ancients of Moo Moo type stuff into their halfway satirical, halfway joke performance art, but it's all also in a way kind of prophetic.
This is going to really only work for a British audience, but there's a comedian here in the UK, one of the most popular and successful, called Steve Coogan, and he has a character called Alan Partridge, who's a really, really awful, dreadful, beige, middle-of-the-road field TV broadcaster come radio presenter. But in one episode of his TV show, the character, Alan Partridge, is trying to get his TV job back, and so he's desperately pitching program ideas to the BBC executive. And this is probably made in the late 90s, and he's just clutching at straws. He hasn't got any ideas left, so he's just making things up, like he's saying, cooking in prison, inner city sumo, monkey tennis. He's got no ideas at all. He's just talking, just verbal diarrhea. And somebody recently did an analysis, and they looked back, and in some slightly modified form or other, pretty much all the bullshit shows that he pulled out of thin air have actually been made. It was just incredible.
No, I love Steve Coogan. He's great. I know what you're talking about too. That I've ever since I saw the is it Trismegistus? What that film that he did, it was kind of an indie film where he's playing sort of the reincarnation of Hermes Trismegistus. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
I can't think of the name of it. I saw it whenever it came out, like 2005, somewhere in there. But yeah, I've liked Steve Coogan ever since. He's helped me where I'm working on, not literally helped me, but playing his clips has helped me get my Michael Caine impersonation right. But
oh right, okay, I see. It's just, you know, life imitating art, or life imitating a joke.
Right,
you know?
right, exactly.
Now we've talked a bit about music that's come up, and we're here to talk about movies, but I will just say that in many of the ways that movies function, socially, culturally, you can say the same about music, as you just pointed out with the KLF and the top 10 thing. And one of the sidebars in your book, I noticed that you mentioned Dave McGowan, now sadly passed on, and he was one of my guests here, and he talked about his book, Strange Scenes from Laurel Canyon. I'm mangling the title there actually, but it's something along the all about Laurel Canyon in California and the so-called hippie dream, the summer of love and all that. And reading your book brought all of that back to me in many ways. I'm just thinking, yeah, this is one big industry, isn't it really? Pop culture.
Yeah, in fact, I read Dave's book in January of last year, and then decided before my book came out that I would actually drive out to Hollywood, because I grew up in San Diego, but I haven't been back there since I was a kid. So my girlfriend and I drove out there this last summer, and we went to Laurel Canyon, and it's all true. It's all there. It's, as the story goes, it's the facility is now converted into a house. It's Jared Leto, the actor's house now, but you can still see the remnants and old signs of the Air Force stuff there. So there's, these big signs still, sort of dusty old signs that say property of Air Force and stuff like that. But yeah, it's kind of a closed off, private residence now. A really, really skinny road too when you drive up into those hills there. But the other thing that I didn't realize, and I know this is kind of stupid, I probably should have known this, being that I've written about all this stuff, but you don't realize this stuff until you go and experience it. But you have to take Mulholland Drive to get up there. So, here I've been watching David Lynch movies and writing about this stuff for a long time, and I didn't even realize that you have to drive up Mulholland Drive to then go up Wonderland Avenue. And great titles there, by the way. Wonderland Avenue is where the Laurel Canyon film studio is that Dave wrote about and kind of popularized. And so, yeah, that's all true. What he pointed out there was that, hardly anybody knew that there was this secret Pentagon deep state run film studio that all the, A-listers of the 40s and 50s had access to, Disney and Cary Grant and Marilyn Monroe and all these kind of people. And then, that we don't even know exactly all of what they produced there, what exactly was going on. We do know that the atomic bomb footage was produced there. That is, I've verified that on the, I think on the Air Force website. Like they'll have these old archives where you can go look that up. So that's all true, and it's just one more pretty big piece of evidence. And in fact, I most of my book was already written before I read Dave's book and learned all that. So actually I had to go back and kind of add some of that because I thought it was so germane to the topic that I was writing on. I was like, well, this is great stuff. This is pretty big info that Dave's pointing out here. So I had to add all that. And yeah, his book is indispensable. In fact, Amazon actually just groups our books together, like if you like this, then also buy these two together for whatever. So, So yeah, I think my book, I wouldn't say that Dave's I have a lot more respect. He's an older, wiser man than me, but yeah, I'm honored to be linked there with Dave by Amazon, the great AI Google brain there, putting us together.
Well, we talked about dystopian films, and particularly 70s dystopian films. It really seemed to be something in the air back then, wasn't there? Around the time of the oil crisis, and it was starting to occur to people that maybe the industrial Western lifestyle wasn't sustainable. Now that, of course, all went away in the 1980s. We had TV shows like Dallas and Dynasty and Miami Vice, and all that stuff. But one of my favorite films from back in the day is Rollerball. And to me, it's a great dystopian film, well produced. I think a really good balance between brains and brawn. That's to say, it's a good action film. There's lots of violence in it, basically, like enjoyable screen, rough and tough kind of stuff. It's basically about a future sport, isn't it? And there's a lot of thoughtful layers. In fact, it's the lead protagonist, played by James Caan, who's the sports star, a guy that superficially appears to have not too much going on upstairs, but he gradually starts to think about what's being asked of him and what this game, Rollerball, is all really about, and its social purpose. And all of that, it's interesting in itself, but all of that makes me think about the commonalities between the movies and also big screen sports, the popular mass sports that, you guys have got baseball, basketball, American football, we got soccer over here, and there are others, of course, and these sort of things that command people's attention, and that functions in a very similar way too.
That's a great point. There's a bunch of movies that have kind of made this point. You've got Death Race, like you said, you've got Rollerball, you've got Running Man, and a lot of those I do cover. Hunger Games, obviously now, which is just a repeat of all that same idea. But the more that I think about it, I think you're really onto something here, because the past few weeks I've been tracking the top 10 stories at Google. Because I wrote a bunch of articles and analyses, some of which would get really good rankings in Google, and then others wouldn't. So I'm trying to figure out what's going on here, and it must be, what movies people are Googling and stuff like this. And so I've been watching the trends, which I've never really done or cared about, but every freaking day the top 10, I'm not joking, every day, the top 10 stories, except for maybe one story, are sports. So I've been living in this bubble of the arts and all this kind of stuff, entertainment and so forth. And the whole rest of the country, and presumably the Western world, as you're talking about, all they care about is fucking sports.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess this should have been obvious, but you realize that when you look at the Google Analytics, that's the only thing that people are fucking searching and Googling is, and I hate sports, by the way, but, man, I don't mind playing basketball, but, I mean, I can't stand pro sports. Yes, this is why the Super Bowl, which I think we've covered it the past couple times at Jay's analysis in different means and formats, just because it is a giant social engineering ritual event. And this is where they interject all the socialism, all the communism, all the various isms that you want to about getting rid of guns and all this kind of stuff is all tied into, you need Obamacare, all this kind of stuff. Now, whatever you think about those topics, I'm not trying to argue nationalized health care or any of that. I'm just saying that why does the Super Bowl have to tell me all this stuff? Why does the Super Bowl have to, preach transgenderism to me? Literally, by the way. Why do I have to watch Madonna doing these ridiculous Babylonian tributes and so forth, and Lady Gaga doing human sacrifice reenactments and all this kind of nonsense? Well, because it is all the ancient tribal warfare repackaged in a most ridiculous fast food format. It's really what it is. And once you realize that, it kind of dispels it all the mystique falls away, and it's kind of like, I mean, most people, for example, don't want to sit and watch advertisements all day, right? I mean, you want to skip through the commercials most of the time. But what is the Super Bowl? And I don't just mean the famous commercials at the Super Bowl, which everybody thinks are really funny and cute and clever. The entire Super Bowl is just one big long advertisement, right? I mean, that's what we were saying about a lot of these movies, is that you eventually realize that this isn't artwork. This is just the whole movie is trying to sell me some bullshit. So, again, I know that that's probably old hat to you and a lot of the audience, but it's just really amazing when you stop and think about the scope of this, that everyone is really just completely entranced with these stupid sports rituals. And, so it's no wonder that the whole civilization is going to shit. I mean,
I've had verbal jousting matches with people about mainline sports, particularly big events, global events or national events, about them being like the Colosseum, in Rome.
Yeah, exactly.
Bread and circuses for the masses, a conduit for some kind of aggression, if not violence. And that's what the sport called rollerball in the film of the same name was all about. It was a way to channel your nationalism and your aggression. Someone else would get up there, so you didn't have to, sort of thing. But I've had people, nah, don't be stupid. It was a totally different situation in Rome. People were actually dying out there. And then every time...
Well, that's where they're going to take it, by the way.
Well, I do wonder. I really do wonder, because one of the things that happens during rollerball, this already violent sport. Spoiler alert, people. Okay? Spoiler alert. Towards the end of the film, the rules get more and more relaxed, and because the game hasn't gone the way that the people behind it wanted it to go, they say, okay, no rules. That's the last round of the game. No rules. And I do wonder, what led you down that? Has that been a gradual thing, or was there kind of a light bulb moment when you thought about the future of sport along those lines?
Well, I was just noticing, and I'm embarrassed to say, well, actually I did one podcast on Hunger Games, and I haven't gotten around to a lot of in fact, I wanted to do maybe one master article on all of these, like Old Boy or not Old Boy, or whatever the predecessor to Hunger Games is, the Asian film. It escapes me at the moment, but yeah, Death Race needs to be done, Rollerball needs to be done. There's a whole bunch of these, and what you notice is that Running Man, I actually think reality TV was a preparation not just for the mass surveillance state, but also to take us to that kind of stuff. Literally. In fact, there's this story going around, I assume it's true, that in Russia right now they're starting up this new reality show that is something like that. It's like Survivor, where there's going to supposedly not be rules. Now that could be all fiction and it could be just hype. Because what a lot of these reality shows do is they will have writers and they'll concoct these scenes. They're not actual, organic, improv type. Well, I guess you could say they're improv and that they're, the people are creating the drama, and hyping it up. But, no, now that could be what's going on. But what I think is that whatever this, new Survivor series that's going to be in Russia is supposed to be, the next step beyond Survivor, or the next step beyond those kinds of shows where it's no holds barred and there's no rules and you can do whatever. And I think there have been shows where they've been dropping people out in the wilderness naked, see how long you can survive, this kind of stuff. I really, honestly, truly think that all of this is moving us to the total gladiatorial Running Man type scenario. Absolutely. And now you think, well, no, that'll never happen. That's crazy. Actually, there are articles and books coming out now about that cannibalism is actually just a natural practice. Now, this is in tandem with all the zombie craze and the zombie shows and Walking Dead and all this kind of stuff and all the zombie movies. And I'm telling you, that's what you're going to have. I will not be surprised in 20 years when there is giant global, cannibal race or something, like where you have to drive your car and ram into people and you get points and then you got to eat them or some shit like that. I don't know, but that's where we're going.
Well, a couple of things about that. I mean, it's kind of like drug addiction in a way, in terms of escalation. And the question is if people are saying, no, Jay, yeah, I agree with you, they're going to ramp things up, but there'll be a point beyond which it cannot go. Well, I think it does function a bit like drugs. You're chasing that same buzz. You're chasing that hit and you got to do more and do more to get it. And as things become normalized, which is something you get into in the book and something we'll come back to again with regard to, for example, child abuse, these things get normalized and it doesn't take the majority of people on the planet to agree with something or to believe something for it to kind of become the new normal. And when you take that step, it's very difficult to go back, never mind rolling things back. At what point would you say enough is enough? Because then what you've got a situation where, well, if we don't make it, someone else will. There's that whole argument about these things. And the other comical thing about these Lord of the Flies type scenarios that you get with these sort of game shows, Survivor things, is that the fact that you're watching this happening, there's a bunch of guys, a camera, and there's a boom mic, with a little furry thing on it. And they're all there's a director. All these guys are stood around. Now, something like Big Brother, you've got a camera. Apparently, cameras in the rooms, and there's no one operating them. They're remote, and of course they're being monitored, but there isn't anyone in the room. But as we know, it's the Big Brother house. You know what I mean? It's an artificial, controlled environment.
Yes.
So, in that sense, anybody can step in at any time, can't they, and say enough's enough? And that's what was supposed to happen in The Running Man, for example,
Yes. Well, yeah, no, that normalization is the brutalization of the mass psyche. And I just did an analysis of Clockwork Orange, and that's what I realized was going on this time around. Because I've seen the film many times, and of course, a lot of times you don't notice stuff until, maybe 10 years later when you watched it for the 5th time or something. But I noticed that Alex's character is when he's undergoing the Ludovico process of being desensitized, being entrained to vomit, whenever he sees certain imagery. He's being brutalized, right? So he's being forced to watch the worst stuff, which puts him into a catatonic state. That is the process. And so, and I link that presentation in the film. I didn't do an analysis of the novel. This is just the Kubrick version, but I link that to MK Ultra because I firmly believe that the whole ultimate goal of MK Ultra was actually mass consciousness. I don't think that they cared so much about creating some mind control assassin. Who cares about that when you just hire somebody to be an assassin? Why do you need mind control assassins? But I think those kinds of studies were valuable for what they would tell you at the macro level. So if you do a whole bunch of studies on individuals and traumatizing them and, creating altars or whatever, then the real value of that research from the social engineering aspect is for the mass audience. And so I think that all this stuff the theater of cruelty, as it's called, the brutalization of the mass psyche. This is ultimately just to create the omegas. What Huxley talks about in Brave New World, that sort of lowest class of the groupings, right? Where the drone people out there, the slugs.
Yeah, never the alpha male. You're talking about the omega male.
Well, it's funny because in Brave New World, which Huxley says in the introduction to the novel, that this is the final stage of all the revolutions from the French Revolution. Well, actually, he says the Scientific Revolution, French Revolution, Industrial Revolution. He says all those revolutions were leading to the final stage, and he says Brave New World is that final stage. And what's funny is that you think that, this was all to create, the great democracy, the great equal society. And then you realize that in Huxley's world, it's not equal at all. You have rigid class structures of the alphas, the betas, right, the omegas and so forth. And so the lowest slug class that is just kind of these goblin type creatures, they're kind of the factory worker, janitor types, right? And they have like a really low IQ. They can't do anything substantial in terms of just basically pushing buttons and sweeping the floor. But what's interesting is that every one of those sectors of that society has, propaganda that's targeted to that sector. So even if you're a quote alpha, they're all still processed into the global social order. Yeah,
it's like in the Time Machine with H.G. Wells. I know he was certainly an insider in these terms, albeit before the age of the cinema. Right. What was in the Time Machine? You've got the Eloi and the
Morlocks, yeah.
Morlocks and the Eloi. That was right. Yeah, and the thing about these societies, the caste system that you end up with in these societies is that the slugs, as you memorably call them, that tends to be the biggest class, I suppose, as you might expect. The elites are so-called, by definition, are going to be the smallest.
Well, this is the base of the pyramid. The base of the pyramid is the biggest part.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the same with communism, wasn't it? Communism, the great level.
Absolutely.
Except in communist Russia, or anywhere else for that matter, look at North Korea now, for God's sake, but communist Russia, you've still got a load of guys living in mansions, eating beluga caviar and drinking Stolichnia, and, you and I are out there, drinking stuff made from potatoes.
Victory gin, and we're hammering the rocks in half. For no reason.
Exactly, but it's all right because we're all in it together, except we're not. You mentioned the Hunger Games there, and you referred back to The Running Man. I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a film I'd recommend. I think the British Film Institute brought this out on DVD. That they're quite good at putting out movies that just make no commercial sense to put out, but they then they charge you like $50 for a DVD, but that's fine because you can't get them anywhere else. And the film's called Punishment Park. I don't know if you've seen that.
No, I haven't.
I think I'm struggling to remember the director's name. I think it might be Peter Watkins or something like that. Now, if people look that up and it's not him, sorry, but the film's called Punishment Park, and he also did a film called The War Game that was actually banned in the UK for many years because it was considered to be, it was made before Threads, and it was considered to be too realistic a depiction of nuclear war for people to be able to see it. And in his film Punishment Park, it's criminals are basically taken out into the middle of the desert. When I say desert, I don't mean like Sahara. I mean like, Mojave or something like that, like American setting. And they're basically cut loose. And that's their one chance. And then there's, I don't remember the name of the people who go after them, but they're basically hunted.
Yes.
But in theory, they've got a chance to survive. And the film was made in the 60s, I think.
Huh. Wow, no, I had not heard of that, but it does remind me. We've been seeing this trend in movies lately of this kind of a plot. I remember when I was in high school, there was that not that great film, goofy one with like Gary Busey and Ice-T, Lone Survivor. But that's the plot. He's like a crook, and he's caught, and he's bought by some sort of elites, and they go to some island, and then it's like, start running because we're coming. And they've paid to hunt people. And so you've heard these whispers of this kind of stuff going on. I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't go on. I mean, this is kind of the Eli Roth plot of Hostel and Hostel 2, and well, they're eating people there, right? And there's another. Now, Roth says I don't know if this is true or not, but he claims that he heard about these stories of this going on in like Malaysia or Indonesia or somewhere. So this is where he got the idea for this film. Now, I wouldn't be surprised, given all the other stuff we've heard about the so-called elite. But there was another. There was a British film. I thought it was pretty brutal. I had a hard time watching it, but or it may have been a Scottish film, but it's called Kill List. Have you seen that?
I haven't, but I have heard of it. Yeah, it was talked about a great deal.
Yeah, this is kind of in the same vein too, where you've got these sort of elites that are hiring hitmen, and the hitman. I don't want to spoil it, but he's being inducted into a kind of secret society, and the induction process is not a pretty thing. I'll put it that way. So we do see this trend popping up in film quite a bit too.
Did you hear the rumors about Dick Cheney and this hunting humans?
Yeah, I have heard this rumor, but I don't know. Again, there's so many different kind of whispers and rumors like this. So who knows what the truth is? But I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Well, we're not accusing Dick Cheney of anything here, by the way. It's just something that was doing the rounds a few years ago.
Right.
And interestingly, I kind of my first go-to belief for that was like, I could see that. It kind of seemed plausible. Which is kind of disturbing in itself.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Death Race 2000, and interestingly, that's just been remade.
Right.
It actually looks like it might be quite a faithful, sort of well-intentioned remake, possibly partly because it wasn't a big movie ever back in the day anyway. The original actually stars David Carradine and Sylvester Stallone, of all people. Probably a film Stallone, I'd imagine, would rather not. He probably hasn't got that on his CV, let's put it that way.
He's got it on Laserdisc.
Yeah. The film itself, it's been remade, and that reminds me actually of a phenomenon that we've been seeing it for a long time now, but when I hear about movies being remade, I kind of hold my head in my hands in despair, not because they're necessarily going to do a bad job of it, though almost invariably they do, but just because, come on guys, is that it? Is that all you got? And it seems like, if you implied that there was a lot of intelligence or at least thought behind this process, you would say, well, yeah, they're just taking something that was popular anyway, they're just going to redo it, and the gamble is, 99% chance it'll be popular again. But I don't even think it's that well thought out on some levels, and remaking things is kind of then it occurs to me as well that, and I found this actually with Death Race 2000, I was talking to some people about it, some younger people once again, and a generation in culture I often like to say it's about 10 years. There'll be a lot of people who don't know the original films, even with well-known films, films that I can think of, well, man, that was a blockbuster back in the day, and they just seem to have no shame whatsoever about doing a watered-down, grey, apathetic, vanilla, just rehash of it and just being completely lazy,
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, the remakes are done solely because they feel like it's a good investment and they won't lose money because all the people who, they have this all actuaried out and they know all the markets and the niches and, if we remake Saved by the Bell, we can get, X, Y, Z, 10 million people to come watch it and that'll generate X, Y, Z amount of money and all this nonsense. But I wonder too, like you're saying, maybe there is also a deeper aspect to where they think anything that might be positive or redeemable in the older versions of these things can be actually destroyed by remaking them into some big CGI vomit disaster. That's it. Even though it might make money, like you said, who's going to go see the original now that the younger generations are going to be watching these rehashes? But this has been going on in entertainment for a long time, as I know you're aware and we're all aware, to where you just get copies of copies of copies, and the 35th instantiation of somebody trying to be, I don't know, Jerry Lewis or the Beatles or something like that is just awful. You know what I mean? So maybe it's part of the wrecking ball phenomena, or maybe it's just the inherent nature of the beast that when the government and money controls the arts, what else can you expect?
Well, thinking about remakes and how they change over time, a good example for me, and a lot of people will be familiar with the movie I Am Legend, with Will Smith starring in that, and it's, basically a zombie movie at the end of the day. That's based on the book of the same title by Richard Matheson called I Am Legend, which is a very good read, by the way. And if you read the book, you won't be surprised that there's a lot more going on. It's much more sophisticated than you would otherwise think. And then Last Man on Earth, I think, was the first movie version of that with Vincent Price.
Yes.
And that's a black and white film. And that's what I'd call pretty low on action, pretty high on thoughtfulness, and very much faithful to the book in the sense it's very much about how this guy feels, believing that he is the last man on Earth, the last human. And it really emphasizes again what's in the book, which is that towards the end of the book, the protagonist realizes that actually the time for humans has just been and gone, and that actually what's happened to the world and what's happened to the human race, he believes to be a disaster. But he realizes that he's the only human left alive, so he's the only person that thinks that. And the creatures who are coming after him, creatures of the night, one of them, the leader of their group, basically says this much to him in a speech, outside his window. He said, you've had your time. It's ours now, and what you get from the book and from the original film is like, these people, what about their point of view? We think it's all bad because we're so human-centric. But the Earth will now just have different inhabitants. That's all it is. It's natural in a way. Then you fast forward to the remake in the 70s that you mentioned earlier, the Omega Man, starring Charlton Heston. Compared to the original film, it looks pretty dumb. Pretty big on action. Charlton Heston, people think of him. Now, I was quite surprised to discover how erudite, how intelligent Charlton Heston was. I know he's got his haters, because of the whole NRA thing, if you see what I mean. But he's kind of the epitome of macho cinema star all his era. So compared to the Vincent Price film, this looks like pretty dumbed down. But looking back at it now, that actually seems really switched on, and some of the messages I mentioned from the original film and the book still come through. But then you get to the Will Smith film, and I found that kind of entertaining, but very unsatisfactory in many ways, because not only had they watered down a lot of the aspects in the book, they basically got a happy ending. And the book does not have, from the point of view of humanity, does not have a happy ending. But they just had to put it in there. And that's something I always used to enjoy about John Carpenter. He wasn't afraid to have a really bleak ending, like, oh fuck, and then just roll titles, And it seems like we can't do that now.
From my cold, dead hands.
Oh, very good, very good.
That's my Charlton. What do you think? Does it sound right?
Yeah, well, you've got nothing to compare it to now, and that's pretty good. I heard Charlton Heston on the radio reading Shakespeare from memory, so he wasn't reading it, so he reciting Shakespeare from memory. Great big screeds of it. He just had it down, and the whole interview with him, I was very impressed with him, and I'm not taking any position on guns here. I'm just saying I was impressed with him as a man, But
he was known to be a very impressive guy. I've heard a lot of those stories too.
But yeah, two things there. One is how the remakes seem incapable. That has to be kind of dumbed down, but also how people accept that as kind of like you couldn't remake Last Man on Earth and make it true to the book and have it be a mass blockbuster like I Am Legend with Will Smith. It just wouldn't work.
Right. Well, so because you have a test audience, exactly. So you bring in the people and you have the different endings and you test which one does best with the audiences, and then it's determined based on what's going to sell the tickets and who's going to go say, oh, you got to go see this, has a happy ending and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, it's a great point about John Carpenter. I've been working my way through an analysis of all the John Carpenter movies. I think I've got about 4 or 5 of them done so far. But that is a great pattern there that, he doesn't always leave you with a happy ending, because that's not necessarily reality. And, that's not to say that film and fictional presentations always have to present reality. But yeah, I mean, this is just another example of consumerism and the market dictating and determining where the arts must go. And then on top of that is the dictating and determining on the basis of, the social engineers and technocrats. And I think that the best way to explain what you're talking about is that scene. I think I included in the book, I mentioned it many times, is the scene again in Brave New World where you have Mustafa Mond, who's the world social controller, explaining to John the Savage and some of the other rebels, why it is that the global government has to control the arts and sciences. And he says, we can't have anybody learning metaphysics, and we can't have anybody learning true science and studying the arts, he says, because that would undermine our whole system. And it's very interesting to me that those are the areas that he's worried about. It's the arts and metaphysics and true science. Those are the two areas that the world social controller in the novel says have to absolutely be censored and controlled, because those are the real areas where you could have a breakdown of the existing control structure. And so that would be my answer as to why they have to continually dumb it down, because you can't have good art or the arts or real aesthetics and this kind of stuff, because it would lead to the collapse of the existing system. I mean, this is what they say, right?
Carpenter's a great example of a filmmaker that almost doesn't exist anymore. You know, the true auteur.
Yes.
You know, whose whole philosophy, whose whole fibre of his being goes into his films, good or bad. You know, you can watch all John Carpenter's films and see the same things coming up again and again. Even when he obviously pays homage to his heroes, you know, like his, what's the name of the guy who directed all the westerns, that Carpenter worships. And, Carpenter's based quite some of his films, including his adaptation of Who Goes There, which came out under the banner of The Thing, is kind of got a lot of Howard Hawks. That's the guy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, apparently Carpenter's very much influenced by him. And then you've got another one of my favourites, David Cronenberg.
Yeah.
Different types of films. Well, some similarity, I suppose, sci-fi horror in the early days. But to me, it's interesting if you look at those guys, they had brushes with mainstream success. And probably Carpenter's, one of his most mainstream films is probably Big Trouble in Little China. I think it was the last movie he made with a big studio. And you look at David Cronenberg had a brush with success as mainstream success with The Fly. I think Big Trouble in Little China and The Fly might even both have been 1986. I'm not sure exactly, but around that.
They were. Yeah, they were.
Well, there you go. And I just think it's interesting. You look at those films now, how layered they are and how expansive and expressive and just things that we don't think of those now as, I mean, again, imagine screening either one of those movies now to an audience of slugs along the line that you mentioned. I just think, I'm not sure they'd be able to cope with them. You know, there's just too much going on. You know, even though both films can work superficially, you know.
Well, funny you mentioned that, because I've been rewatching Videodrome. That's in the stack to do too, and that is another example of what we're talking about, right? The brutalization process of the masses that we were getting at earlier with all the gladiatorial type films. That's what Cronenberg is saying. He's saying that this whole machine is designed and here to do that very thing. I mean, that's the whole point of that movie. There's other points to the movie too, but you know, the Videodrome is this entity that enters you and becomes a mental virus and recreates you, right, in this kind of tumor sense. And this is what happens, you know, to the James Woods character in the film. So I'm glad you mentioned David Cronenberg, but yes, there's all kinds of stuff going on in movies like Big Trouble in Little China, which I did do an analysis of that too. And I mean, you've got him talking about the like Asian gangs and the organ trade and sex trafficking. That's in Big Trouble in Little China. This ridiculous film that's partly satirical, but who even recalls that that's what's going on in that film? But it is. So I wonder if, you know, I argue that there's a whole lot going on in John Carpenter movies that I think most of the time a lot of people are oblivious to, and you're absolutely right. There's no way that those films would test with audiences today. But I want to say that In the Mouth of Madness was a commercial success too, and I think that was a big studio, because that's the completion of the Apocalypse trilogy. So you have The Thing, and you have Prince of Darkness, and then you have In the Mouth of Madness, which are supposed to be John Carpenter's Apocalypse trilogy.
Yeah, I tend to forget about that film because for many years I saw it a long time ago and really didn't like it, didn't enjoy it. And I think I wrote it off in my mind without going back to it. So I was having a discussion recently because I think it was on TV or something. It's a couple of friends who are heavily into movies were saying, "Oh, it's great, you know." And I said, "Oh, I just remember it being really boring." But I rewatched
it, and I didn't like it when it came out, and I rewatched it and I think it's good now. I think it does fit well in the the loosely titled Apocalypse trilogy. I bet you'd like it if you went back and watched it, because it's definitely one of those ones that ends with a we're all fucked kind of scenario.
Yeah, totally. I do need to rewatch that. You would have been, if you'd been in town here a few weeks ago, you'd have been a happy bunny, because the local cinema here started out life as a purely art house cinema, and all they ever used to do was show double bills of horror and sci-fi. It was super cool. And but since being bought out and made a commercial cinema, it's in a much better building now with proper facilities. But anyway, as a nod to their art house past, every now and again they show cult films or films that you just don't see anymore. Or films that are popular, like The Exorcist, for example. They'll put that on the big screen, because a lot of people have never seen films like that on the big. I mean, they had The Omen
on a screen, right?
Yeah, they had The Omen on the big screen every week, and I know that film the other week. Sorry, I know that film back to front, but it was just great to see it in the big screen. Like at 100 watts blasting out the volume at you. And anyway, the point is, they had Videodrome on the other week, and I'm such a fan of seeing films on the big screen, because I saw stuff in that film I'd never actually noticed before.
Right.
Just because it was displayed so large. One other thing before I forget is that I've seen tiny little books devoted to an analysis of individual movies. There's a whole series of them. I can't remember what the series is called. And I saw one devoted to The Thing, but there is a book that might interest you if you haven't seen it, and it's called Order in the Universe, the films of John Carpenter. And I read it back in the early 90s. So it's been out for a while, but if you haven't seen it, that's probably something you might want to, it's not a very long book, you might want to cast your eye over that.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I'll definitely get that. That's a great recommendation there.